Hi, so reading from the Great Ideas, Volume 2 of the Great Books of the Western World collection, Chapter 66, Philosophy. The difficulties which attend the consideration of any great idea by philosophers or others appears with peculiar force in the traditional discussion of philosophy itself. The word philosophy not only varies in its descriptive significance, now designating one part of learning, now another, and sometimes even an attitude of mind or a way of life. But it also varies as a term of evaluation. It is seldom used without expressing either praise or dispraise of the methods and accomplishments of philosophy, or of the calling and character of the philosopher. On the descriptive side, the meaning of the word ranges from a conception of philosophy which covers all branches of scientific knowledge, and which contrasts philosophy with poetry, history, and religion, to a conception of philosophy in which the primary point is its contrast to science and its association with poetry and religion as works of vision, speculation, or belief rather than of knowledge. On its evaluative side, the word philosophy, in quotation, sometimes eulogizes the love and search for truth, the pursuit and even the attainment of wisdom. At the other extreme, it derogates vain learning, idle disputation, and the dogmatism of unsupported opinion. At one time, the good name of the philosopher stands in contrast to the questionable reputation of the sophist. At another, in quotes, philosopher carries almost the same invidious connotation as sophist, quotation marks. The, the dismal the dismissal of philosophy as useless or at best ornamental in the practical affairs of society is sharply opposed to the vision of an ideal state which can come to pass only if philosophers are kings or kings philosophers. These shifts in meaning of the words, in quotation, philosophy and philosopher, quotation marks, record crises in the history of Western thought. They reflect the characteristic formations of our culture in its major epochs. The great books of antiquity, for example, seem to give no intimation of a division between science and philosophy. Particular bodies of knowledge, such as physics or mathematics, are indifferently regarded as sciences or branches of philosophy. The crown of knowledge is wisdom, approached as one rises in the hierarchy of knowledge to the highest science or the first philosophy. Aristotle and Plato may disagree in naming or defining the type of knowledge which deserves to be called wisdom, yet for both it is the ultimate attainment of philosophical inquiry or scientific work. The differences between Plato and Aristotle discussed in chapters on dialectic and metaphysics, the one using dialectic as the name for the supreme form of knowledge, the other using theology, quotation marks, to name the summit of the sciences, do not affect their agreement that the philosopher is a man of knowledge, not opinion, and that is his ultimate goal, and that his ultimate goal is wisdom. If there is any distinction in antiquity between science and philosophy, it seems to find expression in the sense in which Socrates speaks of philosophy as the love of wisdom, implying thereby its pursuit rather than its attainment. A man would not be called a scientist in a particular field, mathematics, let us say, unless he actually had some mathematical knowledge. But a man who is not actually wise can be called a philosopher by virtue of his effort to become wise. Apart from this point of distinction, the Greeks tend to identify philosophy with the fundamental sciences, which somehow yield speculative or practical wisdom. Considering the whole of human learning, all its arts and disciplines, we see that the things the ancients distinguish from philosophy are poetry, history, and the particular productive arts or crafts. Here again, Plato and Aristotle do not make the distinction in the same terms. Plato compares the poet unfavorably with the philosopher in the Republic. The poet is an imitator or of imitations and moves on the level of images and beliefs, whereas the philosopher rises above the imagination to the level of ideas, which are the only true objects of knowledge. Aristotle, on the other hand, seems to pay poetry a compliment when in the Poetics he says that it is more philosophical than history because it deals with the universal rather than the particular. These attitudes toward poetry in relation to philosophy are somewhat reversed by the fact that for Plato, myth and poetry provide materials from which philosophical insights can sometimes be distilled, whereas for Aristotle, sense experience is the source from which, by induction, the principles or axioms of philosophical knowledge are obtained. Despite these differences, their accord on the supremacy of the philosopher remains unaffected. More than poetry and history and all the knowledge that can be applied productively, philosophy represents the highest use of man's faculties. On this, Aristotle and Plato seem to be agreed, even though Aristotle distinguishes the philosophical from the political life and assigns the most perfect happiness to the contemplative activity of the philosopher, whereas Plato, in the Republic at least, brings the philosopher back to the shadows of the cave after he has seen the light of truth itself, so that he can put his wisdom to practice in the government of the less fortunate fellow men. The practice of philosophy seems to become, for Roman writers, more important than the content of philosophy as a body of doctrine. What is that which is able to conduct a man? Asks Marcus Aurelius. One thing and only one, philosophy. It keeps the inner man free from violence and unharmed, superior to pains and pleasures, doing nothing without a purpose. It enables him to, quote, accept all that happens and all that is allotted, and finally to wait for depth with a cheerful mind as being nothing else than a dissolution of the elements of which every living being is compounded, end quotation. To Aurelius, his imperial court is like a stepmother to whom one must be dutiful, philosophy like a mother from whom one gains solace and help. Quote, return to philosophy frequently and repose in her, end quote, he tells himself, so that what thou meetest with in the court appears to thee tolerable, and thou tolerable in the court, end quotation. The Stoic conception of philosophy as a moral discipline and as a consolation creates that sense of the word in which the familiar injunction to a person in distress, quote, be philosophical, end quote, carries the same meaning as, quote, be stoical, end quote. Philosophy provides only peace of mind, not worldly riches or external power. Philosophy, quote, philosophy does not promise to secure to man anything outside himself, says Epictetus, nor does it fulfill its promise of inner strength without stern resolution to withdraw desire from the goods of fortune. Quote, do you suppose that you can be a philosopher if you do as you do now? Question. Quote, Epictetus asks, do you suppose that you can eat and drink as you do now, and indulge your anger and displeasure just as before? Question. No, you must sit up late. You must work hard, conquer some of your desires. When you have carefully considered these drawbacks, then come to us, if you are willing to pay this price for peace of mind, freedom, tranquility. End quote. Do not try to be first a philosopher, then a tax collector, then an orator, then one of Caesar's procurators. These callings do not agree. You must be busy either with your inner man or with things outside. That is, you must choose between the position of a philosopher and that of an ordinary man. End quote. So I'll just stop on that one. There's a few more pages of that one on philosophy, and I'll just do some on the wisdom chapter. Wisdom. The special character of wisdom among the attainments of the mind shows itself in the things which everyone will agree can be said about wisdom, things which cannot be said about art and science, or knowledge and learning generally. We believe that with the centuries, knowledge can be steadily increased and learning advanced. But we do not suppose that the same progress can be achieved in wisdom. The individual may grow in wisdom. The race does not seem to. In the tradition of the great books, the moderns usually assert their superiority over the ancients in all the arts and sciences. They seldom claim superiority in wisdom. The phrase modern science, quotations, needs no elucidation, but if anyone were to speak of modern wisdom, he would have to explain his meaning, as modern seems to have an immediately acceptable significance when it qualifies science. So ancient seems to go with wisdom. Ancient seems to go with wisdom, and to suggest that with the centuries far from increasing, wisdom may be lost. Wisdom is more frequently and extensively the subject of discussion in the ancient and medieval than in the modern books. The ancients seem to have not only a greater yearning for wisdom, but also a greater interest in understanding what wisdom is and how it can be gained. The traditional discussion of wisdom, furthermore, has its foundations in the literature of the Old and New Testament, as well as in the books of pagan antiquity. This is not true of other forms of knowledge. The teachings of revealed religion open a path to the heart of wisdom. They do not propose methods of scientific research. Again and again, the scriptures proclaim that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, a wisdom which develops with piety, worship, as science develops with experiment and proof. Still another distinctive mark of wisdom is that it cannot be misused. We recognize that bad men as well as good may possess other kinds of knowledge. We have seen artistic skill and scientific truth put to evil use. But we do not ordinarily think a man wise unless he acts wisely. To act wisely is to act well, even as to have wisdom is to use it. The satirist's praise of folly condemns useless wisdom. The theologian's condemnation of worldly wisdom, quotation marks, dismisses it as the worst of folly, a counterfeit of wisdom. Other forms of learning may separate knowledge from action. Wisdom tends to unite them. Other forms of inquiry may be content with knowing and understanding the facts. The pursuit of wisdom aspires to a knowledge of good and evil. Plato, for example, makes the vision of the good the goal of a dialectic which ascends to wisdom, yet which does not rest there, but returns enlightened to the realm of action. This conception of wisdom is hinted at whenever we refrain from calling a man wise simply because he is learned, a scholar, scientist, or philosopher. Again, it is Plato who respects wisdom so highly that he will not call the philosopher wise, but only a lover of wisdom. Quote, "No god is a philosopher or seeker after wisdom, for he is wise already." Socrates says in the Symposium, "Nor does a man who is wise seek after wisdom, neither do the ignorant seek after wisdom. The lovers of wisdom are neither wise nor the ignorant and foolish." As Socrates points out, they are in a mean between the wise and the ignorant. Aristotle would seem to disagree, not from a lower regard for wisdom, but because he identifies wisdom with philosophical knowledge, and especially with that highest branch of speculative science, which is called, quote, theology, quote, versus philosophy or metaphysics. He uses his use of the phrase philosophical wisdom to distinguish speculative from practical, or political wisdom suggests that the philosopher may attain the wisdom he pursues. Yet Aristotle, like Plato, speaks of philosophers or lovers of wisdom, and Plato, like Aristotle, treats wisdom as one of the basic human virtues. We shall return to the distinction which both Aristotle and Aquinas make between practical and speculative wisdom. They often call the latter simply wisdom, in contrast to prudence, which is their name for practical wisdom. Other writers who treat wisdom as one sometimes emphasize its speculative and sometimes its practical aspect. But for all of them, this double aspect remains part of wisdom's special character. Lucretius, for example, finds nothing more gladdening than to dwell in the calm, high places, firmly embattled on the heights by the teaching of the wise, whence you can look down on others and see them wandering hither and thither, going astray as they seek the way of life. The way of life, free from pain, the distress of fear, and futile struggle, is known only to the wise. Calm and repose are here suggested as attributes of the wise men. That also seems to be the implication of Dr. Johnson's, quote, approbation of one who had attained to the state of the philosophical wise man, that is, to have no want of anything. When Boswell observes that then the savage is a wise man, Johnson retorts, "Sir, I do not mean simply being without, but not having a want." For Plotinus, wisdom seems to be purely speculative, and its repose a condition of the reasoning mind at rest. Quote, "Wisdom," he writes, "is a condition of being that possesses repose. Think what happens when one has accomplished the reasoning process. As soon as we have discovered the right course, we cease to reason. We rest because we have come to wisdom." Still, wisdom has a moral for Plotinus an aesthetic aspect. Quote, "One soul," he says, "is wise and lovely, another foolish and ugly. Soul beauty is constituted by wisdom." The practical or moral aspect of wisdom predominates in Milton, Rabelais, and Tolstoy. In Paradise Lost, Adam communicates his reflections on human knowledge to Raphael. But apt the mind or fancy is to rove unchecked, and of her roving is no end. Till warned, or by experience taught, she learn that not to know at large of things remote from use, obscure and subtle, but to know that which before us lies in daily life is the prime wisdom. What is more is fume, or emptiness, or fond impertinence, and renders us in things that most concern unpractised, unprepared, and still to seek. Gargantua, writing a letter to his son Pantagruel, while the latter is a student in Paris, admonishes him in the words of Solomon that wisdom entereth not into a malicious mind, and that knowledge without conscience is but the ruin of the soul. End quote. In War and Peace, Pierre, after reiterating that all we can know is that we know nothing, and that's the height of human wisdom, end quote, learns from the Mason that the highest wisdom is not founded on reason alone, nor on those worldly sciences of physics, chemistry, and the like, into which intellectual knowledge is divided. The highest wisdom, the Mason continues, is but one of science, the science of the whole, the science explaining the whole creation and man's place in it. You might notice that in Manly P. Hall's writing. He's a Mason. I guess he's trying to tell you about the whole world and and man's place in it. Yeah, I'll just may as well comment a bit where it was saying that wisdom, it was saying that a person has repose, and somebody who doesn't want anything, they're quite contented. Well, in the Proverbs, Solomon says wisdom's paths are peaceful, all are pleasant and peaceful. So it's a connection there. Right, I'll move on. God has and to attain this end, to receive that science, continuing on from where I was, it is necessary to purify and renew one's inner self. And to attain this end, we have the light called conscience that God has implanted in our souls. Though Plato defines wisdom as the virtue of reason, that part of the soul which is for him the faculty of knowledge, he gives it the function of directing conduct as well as contemplating truth. Well, that's Solomon said wisdom is good to direct as well. We call him wise, Socrates declares in the Republic, who has in him that little part which rules, and which has a knowledge of what is for the interest of each of the three parts and of the whole. End quote. In the state as in the soul, how can there be the least shadow of wisdom? The Athenian stranger asks in the Laws, where there is no harmony. There is no harmony or wisdom when fair reasonings have their habituation in the soul, and yet do no good, but rather the reverse of good, because reason fails to rule or be obeyed. When the soul is opposed to knowledge, or opinion, or reason, which are her natural lords, the Athenian stranger goes on, that I call folly. Just as it is in the state when the multitude refuses to obey their rulers or the laws. The four virtues which Plato enumerates in both the Republic and the Laws are wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. Justice is given a certain preeminence in the Republic as somehow embracing the other three, but in the Laws, the ruling virtue is wisdom, calling the virtues divine goods to distinguish them from such things as health, beauty, strength, and wealth. The Athenian stranger makes wisdom chief and leader of the divine class of goods. Next, he says, follows temperance, and from the union of these two with courage springs justice. And fourth in the scale of virtue is courage. As the principle of these other virtues, wisdom, like them, engages in the life of action. It does not move solely in the realm of thought. When he refers to wisdom as one of the four virtues, Aristotle uses the word wisdom as if it is named a single virtue. In the passage in the Politics, in which he says that the courage, justice, and wisdom of a state have the same form and nature as the qualities which give the individual who possess them the name of just, wise, or temperate. He does not divide wisdom into the speculative and the practical, but he seldom overlooks that separation. The passage just cited, for instance, begins with the statement that, quote, each one has just so much happiness as he has of virtue and wisdom, and of virtuous and wise action, end quote. Here, the reference to virtue and wisdom places wisdom outside the virtues when the latter are conceived exclusively as moral virtues. Wisdom for Aristotle is a virtue only in the order of intellectual excellence, not of moral excellence or character. As an intellectual virtue, wisdom is not even involved in the growth or exercise of the moral virtues. It is as possible, Aquinas says, following Aristotle, to have the cardinal moral virtues without wisdom, as it is to have them without art or science. But for both Aquinas and Aristotle, this is neither true nor intelligible unless we bear in mind the distinction between philosophical and practical wisdom, or between wisdom and prudence. Though prudence is, no less than wisdom, an intellectual virtue, a quality of mind rather than of character. It belongs with the moral virtues, as in the chapter on virtue indicates. The cardinal virtues, according to Aquinas, include prudence, not wisdom. Similarly, as may be seen in the chapter on prudence, Aristotle's theory holds it impossible to be good without practical wisdom, quote, just as it is impossible to be, quote, practically wise without moral virtue, end quote. Practical wisdom, Aristotle writes, is concerned with things human and things about which it is possible to deliberate, end quote. Philosophic wisdom, on the other hand, will contemplate none of the things that make a man happy, end quote. To explain the difference, Aristotle uses the example of the early Greek sages, quote, we say Anaxagoras, Thales, and men like them have philosophic but not practical wisdom, when we see them ignorant of what is to their own advantage. They know things that are remarkable, admirable, difficult, and divine, but useless. V-I-Z. But it is not human goods they seek. If wisdom connotates the highest form of knowledge, then the name, according to Aristotle, is more properly applied to speculative than to practical wisdom. The highest form of knowledge, in his view, is concerned with the highest objects. Hence, he says it would be strange to think that practical wisdom is the best knowledge, since man is not the best thing in the world. But if the argument be that man is the best of the animals, this makes no difference, for there are other things much more divine in their nature than man, end quote. And wisdom is knowledge, quote, of the things that are highest by nature, end quote. When Hobbes distinguishes between prudence and sapience, he does not assign a special object to wisdom, quote, as much experience is prudence, end quote. He writes, quote, so is much science, sapience, end quote. It is the amount of science a man possesses, not his possession of a particular kind of knowledge, which makes him wise. Descartes seems to take a similar view when he says that, quote, the sciences taken all together are identical with human wisdom, end quote. But for Aristotle and Aquinas, philosophical wisdom can be differentiated from the other speculative virtues, such as understanding of first principles or the scientific knowledge of the conclusions which can be demonstrated from them. It involves them, but it is distinct from them insofar as it uses principles to demonstrate conclusions concerning the highest causes. Like how they put politics high, and so did Solomon. Wisdom can be called a science if it is understood that by reason of its object it stands at the apex of the sciences, crowning and perfecting them. In the opening pages of his Metaphysics, Aristotle identifies wisdom with the supreme philosophical science, the science which investigates first principles and causes. He calls it a divine science, quote, or theology. For as he says, God is thought to be among the causes of all things, and to be a first principle, end quote. It is not the most useful science, but the most desirable on its own account, and for the sake of knowing. It alone exists for its own sake. All the sciences, indeed, are more necessary than this, but none is better, end quote. While adopting Aristotle's conception of wisdom, Aquinas finds it most eminently represented among the sciences, not by metaphysics or the theology of the philosophers, but by sacred doctrine, or the theology based on revelation. Quote, since it is the part of a wise man to order and judge, end quote, he writes, and since lesser matters can be judged in the light of some higher cause, therefore he who considers absolutely the highest cause of the whole universe, namely God, is most of all called wise. But sacred doctrine essentially treats of God viewed as the highest cause, for it treats of him not only so far as he can be known through creatures, just as the philosophers know him, but also so far as he is known to himself alone and revealed to others. Hence, Aquinas concludes, sacred doctrine is especially called wisdom. The contrast between the wisdom of the philosopher and the wisdom of the theologian is more fully discussed in the chapters on metaphysics and theology. Great ideas. It's got all those others. But we are concerned here with the further implications of the difference between natural and supernatural wisdom, or the wisdom of man and of God. The Greeks insistently raised the question whether man can have wisdom. In the Apology, Socrates tells his accusers that his, quote, cross-examination of the pretenders to wisdom, end quote, was a duty imposed upon him by the oracle, which declared that there was no man wiser than himself. To understand the oracle's meaning, he tried to seek out wisdom in other men, but he says at his trial, I found that the men most in repute were all but the most foolish. Interesting how some of the words there relate to the Matrix movie. What was it? The Oracle. The Oracle being a Greek sort of person that kings would go to get information to guide and direct them. Quote, my hearers always imagined, Socrates declares, that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others. But the truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise. Interestingly, in the Bible, you'll hear that quote, to God only wise. And by his answer, he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates. He is only using my name by way of illustration, as if he said, he, O men, is the wisest. Who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing, end quote. Again, in the one of Plato's books, Phaedrus, Socrates, it's about Phaedrus. Socrates refuses to call any man wise, quote, but that is a great name which belongs to God alone. For men, quote, lovers of wisdom or philosophers is the modest and befitting title, end quote. Aristotle also says of the science, which most deserves the name of wisdom, because it is a science of divine things, that such a science either God alone can have, or God above all others, end quote. He does not think the divine power can be jealous, but if there were any truth in what the poets say about the jealousy of the gods, quote, it would probably occur in this case above all, and all who excelled in this knowledge would be unfortunate, end quote. To whatever extent the possession of wisdom, quote, might be justly regarded as beyond human power, end quote, it would be unfitting, in Aristotle's opinion, quote, for man not to be content to seek the knowledge that is suited to him, end quote. This is even more typically a Christian than a pagan sentiment. Christians have a special knowledge, writes Montaigne. How natural and original an evil curiosity is in man. The thirst for knowledge and the desire to become more wise was the first ruin of humankind, and the way by which it precipitated itself in eternal damnation, end quote. In Paradise Lost, as he is about to leave the Garden of Eden, Adam says to the angel Michael, greatly instructed I shall hence depart, greatly in peace of thought, and have my fill of knowledge, what this vessel can contain, beyond which was my folly to aspire. To which the angel replies, this having learnt, thou hast attained the summit of wisdom, sumi of wisdom. But sacred scripture does more than enjoin man to humble himself before the chasm between human wisdom at its best and the infinite wisdom of God. It does more than say, in the words of Jeremiah, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, end quote, for it also says that fools despise wisdom, end quote. In the Epistle of James, we find true wisdom set apart from false. If the knowledge of the wise man is not accompanied by the meekness of wisdom, quote, if instead there's bitter envying and strife in your hearts, end quote, then this wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. St. Paul asks, quote, hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? Question. When the world by wisdom knew not God, it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God, and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Quote, my speech and my preaching, St. Paul continues to the Corinthians, was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Howbeit we speak wisdom among them that are perfect, yet not the wisdom of this world, nor of the princes of this world that come to naught. But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden mystery, which God ordained before the world unto our glory. Wonder is the beginning of the kind of natural wisdom which a philosopher like Aristotle regards as the ultimate goal of human inquiry. But the supernatural wisdom of which Scripture speaks begins with the fear of God and comes to man not through his efforts at learning, but only as a divine gift. Quote, if any of you lacks wisdom, St. James declares, let him ask God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. End quote. It is wrong for a man to take pride in his own learning, but according to Pascal, quote, the proper place for pride, if in wisdom, for it cannot be granted to a man that he has made himself wise. God alone gives wisdom, and that is why qui gloria to in domino gloriatum, end quote. It's butchered some Latin. The theologians dwell at length on the text of the psalmist that, quote, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, end quote, enumerating 7 steps to wisdom, Augustine writes. First of all, it is necessary that we should be led by the fear of God to seek the knowledge of his will, what he commands us to desire, and what to avoid. Now, this fear will of necessity excite us in the thought of our mortality and of the death that is before us, and crucify all the motions of pride as if our flesh were nailed to the tree, unquote. Then in succession come the steps of piety, knowledge, resolution, counsel, purification of heart, and finally the, quote, holy man will be so single and so pure in heart that he will not step aside from the truth, either for the sake of pleasing men or with a view to avoid any of the annoyances which beset this life. Bothersome stuff. Such a man ascends to wisdom which is the seventh and last step, and which he enjoys in peace and tranquility. Only the wisdom which begins with faith, according to Aquinas, also begins with fear. A thing may be called the beginning of wisdom in two ways, he explains. In one way, because it is the beginning of wisdom itself as to its essence, in another way as to its effect. Thus the beginning of an art as to its essence consists in the principles from which that art proceeds, while the beginning of an art as to its effect is that wherefrom it begins to operate. Aquinas then points out that wisdom is considered by theologians in one way, and in another way by philosophers. As the wisdom of the philosophers does not begin with articles of faith, but with axioms of reason, so it does not begin with fear, but with wonder. The wisdom of the philosophers and the wisdom of the religious both consist in knowledge of divine things, but wisdom, as we look at it, Aquinas writes, is considered not only as being cognizant of God, as it is with the philosophers, but also as directing human conduct, since this is directed not only by the human law, but by the divine law. Accordingly, the beginning of wisdom as to its essence consists in the first principles of wisdom, i.e. the articles of faith, and in this sense faith is said to be the beginning of wisdom. But as regards the effect, the beginning of wisdom is the point where wisdom begins to work, and in this way fear is the beginning of wisdom, yet servile fear is one way and filial fear another. For servile fear, Aquinas explains, is like a principle disposing a man to wisdom from without, in so far as he refrains from sin through fear of punishment, and is thus fashioned for the effect of wisdom. On the other hand, chaste or filial fear is the beginning of wisdom, as beginning the first effect of wisdom, for since the regulation of human conduct by the divine law belongs to wisdom, in order to make a beginning, man must first of all fear God and submit himself to him. The special character of wisdom, which we noted earlier, that it is once speculative and practical knowledge, that is, it is concerned both with the ultimate nature of things and the ultimate good for man, seems to be strikingly exemplified in what the theologian calls the gift of wisdom. Wisdom, as Plato conceives it, may have this double character, but for Aristotle, as we have seen, wisdom, as opposed to prudence, is purely speculative. It remains speculative even when it deals with the end, which is in the good of each thing, and in general with the supreme good in the whole of nature. It considers the end or the good, as Aristotle indicates, only under the aspect of investigating the first principles and causes, for the good, i.e. the end, is one of the causes. It does not thereby direct man to his own end or lay down the rules of a good life. The supernatural gift of wisdom, Aquinas tells us, is not merely speculative, but also practical. It belongs to wisdom as a gift, not only to contemplate divine things, but also to regulate human acts. Such infused wisdom not only extends, quote, to the hidden mysteries of divine things, which are beyond the greatest wisdom man can acquire by his natural efforts, but this wisdom also directs man's actions to the sovereign good, which is at the last end, by knowing which man is said to be truly wise. Christian theologians like Augustine and Aquinas do not hold the wisdom of the philosophers in contempt because they fail to penetrate the divine mysteries or to guide man to his salvation. Augustine finds in Plato's teaching a marvelous foreshadowing of Christian wisdom. quote, "It is evident that none come nearer to us than the Platonists," end quote. He says when he attributes to Plato the conception of the wise man as one who imitates, knows, loves this God, and who rendered blessed through fellowship with him in his own blessedness, end quote. Though Aquinas holds that wisdom as a gift is more excellent than wisdom as an intellectual virtue, since it attains to God more intimately by a kind of union of the soul with him, end quote. He certainly regards Aristotle as the epitome of natural wisdom when he refers to him as the philosopher. The admonition of St. Paul to beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, end quote, does not seem to be interpreted by Augustine and Aquinas to mean, as Montaigne later suggests, that, quote, "the plague of man is the opinion of wisdom, and for this reason it is that ignorance is so recommended to us by our religion." But the theologians do condemn the counterfeits of wisdom to which men are susceptible. These are false wisdoms. The wisdom of the philosophers is not false, but imperfect. We find three types of false worldly wisdom listed by Aquinas. If a man fixes his end in external earthly things, he writes, his wisdom is called earthly. If in the goods of the body, it is called sensual wisdom. If in some excellence, it is called devilish wisdom, because it imitates the devil's pride. These worldly wisdoms constitute for him the sin of folly. Quote, "It is the wisdom of the world," Aquinas says, "which deceives and makes us foolish in God's sight." Though no man wishes to be a fool, he adds, yet he wishes those things of which folly is a consequence, viz., to withdraw his sense from spiritual things and to plunge it into earthly things, end quote. The essence of such folly, according to the psalmist, lies in denial. Quote, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God," end quote. But there is another meaning of folly, in which it is neither a sin nor the opposite of wisdom. Quote, "If any man among you seem to be wise in this world," St. Paul declares, "let him become a fool, that he may be wise," end quote. Commenting on this text, Aquinas explains that just as there is an evil wisdom called worldly wisdom, so too there is a good folly opposed to this evil wisdom, whereby man despises worldly things, end quote. If there is wisdom in such folly, so also, according to Aquinas, there can be wisdom in those whom the world regards as natural fools or innocents. If they have grace, he writes, baptized idiots, like little children, have the habit of wisdom, which is a gift of the Holy Ghost, but they have not the act on account of the bodily impediment which hinders the use of reason in them. End quote. Throughout the tradition of the great books, those who praise folly do not take exception to the psalmist's remark that only fools despise wisdom. Rather, they find wisdom in the appearances of folly, and use the wisdom of fools to expose the folly of those who pretend to be wise. Quote, "I every day hear fools say things that are not foolish," Montaigne declares, and echoing him, Touchstone, the clown as You Like It, complains, quote, "The more pity that fools may not speak wisely what wise men do foolishly," end quote. To which Celia replies, quote, "By my troth, thou sayest true, for since the little wit that fools have was silenced, the little foolery that wise men have makes a great show," end quote. And later, after a conversation with Touchstone about the passing of time, Jacques observes, quote, "When I did hear the motley fool thus moral on the time, my lungs began to crow like Chanticleer, that fools should be so deep contemplative. The jesters and clowns in Shakespeare's comedies have a kind of wisdom. In Twelfth Night, the clown who banters with Viola denies that he is the Lady Olivia's fool, but says he is simply her corrupter of words. End quote. The trouble, he explains, is not that he lacks reason, but that words are grown so false that I am loath to prove reason with them. End quote. And he ends by telling Viola, quote, foolery, sir, does walk about the orb like the sun. It shines everywhere. I would be sorry, sir, but the fool should be as oft with your master as with my mistress. I think I saw your wisdom there. Pantagruel persuades Panurge to take counsel of a fool. Quote, the wise may be instructed by a fool, he says. You know how, by the advice and counsel and prediction of fools, many kings, princes, states, and commonwealths have been preserved, battles gained, and diverse doubts of a most perplexed intricacy resolved. End quote. As he who is called a worldly wise man, quote, Pantagruel goes on to remark, may, in the second judgment of the intelligences which are above, be esteemed a fool, so he may be thought a sage who lays, quote, quiet aside those cares which are conducible to his body or his fortunes, all which neglects the sublunary things are vaguely imputed folly. To the same general effect are Pierre's reflection in World, War and Peace on the period of his blissful insanity after the burning of Moscow, when he recalls the views he formed of men and circumstances at the time of his madness. He always finds them correct. I may have appeared strange and queer then, he says to himself, but I was not so mad as I seemed. On the contrary, I was wiser and had more insight than at any other time, and understood all that is worth understanding in life, because I was happy. Folly is not always praised in paradox, nor is it seriously condemned only by the Christian theologian who equates it with denying or turning away from God. Quote, folly, eldest of Jove's daughters, quote, says Agamemnon in the Iliad, shuts men's eyes to their destruction. She walks delicately, not on the solid earth, but hovers over the heads of men to make them stumble or to ensnare them. Time was when she fooled Jove himself. Agamemnon concludes the story of Jove's befuddlement by relating how, in his rage, Jove caught Folly by the hair and swore a great oath that never should she again invade starry heaven and Olympus, for she was the bane of all. Then he whirled her round with a twist of his hand and flung her down from heaven so that she fell on the fields of mortal men. End quote. On the earthly plane, folly takes many forms, of which, in Montaigne's judgment, the most exasperating are dullness of wit, the boldness of stupidity, and contentiousness in argument. Quote, obstinacy of opinion and heat in argument are the surest proofs of folly. End quote. He observes, is there anything so assured, resolute, disdainful, contemplative, serious, and grave as the ass? Quote, end quote. Whatever the forms or aspects of folly, however the wisdom it implies or opposes be conceived, one thing is clear throughout the tradition of the West. No one can separate true wisdom from folly, and disguise places anything but the highest value on it in the order of human goods. The final utterance of the chorus in Antigone that wisdom, quote, wisdom is the supreme part of happiness, end quote. The Aristotelian doctrine that the activity of philosophic wisdom is admittedly the pleasantest of virtuous activities, end quote. And quote, all the other attributes ascribed to the supremely happy man are evidently those connected with his activity. The statement by Plato in his 7th letter, in which he demands that his mirth, correction, the statement by which Plato in his 7th letter, in which he demands that his myth of the philosopher king be taken seriously, for the human race will not see better days until either the stock of those who rightly and genuinely follow philosophy acquire political authority, or else the class who have political control be led by some dispensation of providence to become real philosophers, end quote. All these express the tribute which pagan antiquity pays to wisdom in human life and society. To the Christian, theologian, mystic, or poet, it is in heaven with the saints who dwell in God's presence that wisdom, like love, reigns supreme. Nor are these two unconnected. As charity is the perfection of the will, so wisdom is the perfection of the intelligent. In the Divine Comedy, Aquinas explains to Dante, when they meet in paradise, how lack of wisdom's order in the mind goes hand in hand with love's disorder. Quote, he is very low down among the fools, the Spirit says, who affirms or denies, without distinction, alike in the one and in the other case, because it happens that oftentimes the rash judgment bends in false directions, and then self-love binds the intelligence, end quote. With the ascent on earth rather than on heaven, with the ascent on earth rather than on heaven, with reliance upon reason rather than upon faith, Spinoza voices a comparable insight, that to have wisdom is to love wisely, for to know wisely is to love God. Quote, it is therefore most profitable to us in this life, he writes, to make perfect the intelligent or reason as far as possible, and in this one thing consists the highest happiness or blessedness of man, for blessedness is nothing but the peace of mind which springs from the intuitive knowledge of God. Not only does, quote, the highest possible peace of mind arise from this kind of knowledge, but he adds, from it also necessarily springs the intellectual love of God, end quote. Whew, just finished the essay here. Thank you for listening. Enjoy it.